Hello there, today I wanted to show you a little tutorial on how you can use Copic markers or any alcohol markers of your choice. I will be using the recently released Halloween envelopes from Pretty Pink Posh. I've already gone ahead and stamped the top image in the set using my Memento Tuxedo Black. Memento is my ink of choice when using alcohol markers. It is quick drying, so you can go straight in with your alcohol markers and start colouring. You don't have to wait for it to dry, and it doesn't smudge once you've applied your alcohol markers. There's many different ways of using your alcohol markers, and none of them are the right or wrong way. It's whatever way suits you best, and to be honest with you, I tend to go between many ways of using them depending on my mood or what it is that I'm colouring. For this, I'm colouring a larger area, where I tend to go in first with the darkest colour. In this instance, it's V09. I apply the dark shades to the parts of the image where I feel it's going to be darkest, and then I go in with the next darkest shade and blend that in this instance, V17. And finally, I go in with my lightest colour to fill the area, which is V15. I go over the middle colour and I draw it back out into the lightest colour. On your first application, sometimes this isn't quite effective, and so I tend to go back and forth. Here I'm just showing you that with Copic markers you get a chisel end and a brush end. I always use the brush end of an alcohol marker. I've never used the chisel end. For me, they're futile. Okay, so once I've applied the darkest, then the medium, and then the lightest colour, I then go back in and repeat the process again. Going back in with the darkest, then the medium, and drawing the colours together with the lightest. I tend to find that the second coat, at least from then onwards, is far easier. By then the ink, the ink on the paper, it's quite saturated and it blends better from second application thereon. And as you can see, I go back and forth until I'm quite satisfied with the colours. Just to repeat, in this example, my darkest is the V09. I then go back in with the medium, which is the V17, and then finally my last colour is the V15, the lightest shade. Other ways of doing it would be, and I use this method also, and actually for smaller areas I tend to use this method, would be the opposite way round. Colour everything that you want coloured in your lightest colour, then go back in with your medium colour, and then your darkest colour. And I say medium last and first, or medium, lightest and darkest, as I tend to use 3 colours on a project that I'm working on. Sometimes if I haven't got the full collection of the Copic, sometimes I can work with just 2 colours. But where I do have 3 colours and a larger surface area to cover, I tend to use the 3 colours to get the best shading I feel for myself. It's also worth noting that when using alcohol markers, there simply is no better choice than a super smooth cardstock. Super smooth allows the colours to move around more freely and therefore blend better. If I'm using many layers on my project, I'd go for around a 250 GSM. If there's not going to be many layers on my project, then I can stick to a 300 GSM. But essentially, as long as it is a super smooth cardstock, then your colours, your alcohol markers, should blend just as they are expected to. Also, it's best to work on a porous surface so that the ink, as it passes through the paper through the other side, the porous surface will absorb any excess ink that you're working with. If you work on a porous surface, it tends to just sit on that surface and then can interfere with your blending, as it will bleed back through the back of the paper, and you don't really want that. So the best thing that you can do is work on a porous surface, and here I have a porous craft mat. I do need to point out that I don't consider myself a professional in any way, shape or form with regards to colouring with alcohol markers. I do have several years experience, but I have a very, very long way to go on my journey. For the top of the envelope, I didn't want it to be as dark as the rest of the envelope. I also didn't have enough space to go in with 3 colours to shade, and so the base shade was V15, the lighter shade, and for the shading I just went in with V17 and outlined all the smaller elements of the image, and this gave the desired effect. If I'd gone in with the V09, I do think it would have been perhaps too dark, but also I was only working with a small space, so there wasn't much room to blend. My methodology for using alcohol markers is to apply the darker shade where you would expect something to be darker, and then the lighter shade where you would expect the light to be hitting. But there's no hard and fast rules. This doesn't have to be perfect. I think as crafters, we're our own worst critics, and the recipient, if being gifted, is not going to be judging where the light's hitting and where the shadows would naturally be placed. They're going to enjoy it, and as they enjoy it, we should also enjoy the process too and not be too harsh on ourselves. So in this example where you have the envelope, my theory would be that as the papers fold, there would be shadow in the corners of the folds of the envelope, and a little bit of shadow around objects also. I do apologise, my pug has joined me whilst I'm doing the voiceover for this video. She is on my lap and she is snoring rather loudly, so you may hear her for the remainder of this video. So it's now time to colour the smaller elements of this image. As I said earlier in the tutorial, sometimes with these smaller elements it's not easy to use, or not possible to use, 3 shades of a colour, and so therefore for this little Frankenstein, for example, I'm using just the 2. I'm using the YG25 for the shading around the hairline and YG03 for the remainder of the face. So it's now time to colour the hair of Frankenstein. I did use 3 shades for the hair, but in all honesty, it didn't need 3 shades. 2 would have been quite sufficient. But alas, I went in first this time with the lighter colour. I find that with a smaller area, it's easier to start with a lighter colour. Otherwise, I don't leave any space for the lighter colour, and so the whole thing is pointless anyway. So I went in first with C7. Coloured the whole body of the hair with the C7. Then I went in with the C8 and did some shading around the edge of the hair, and then went in and did the outline with 100. Then I quickly went back in with C7 to blend the 3 shades together. With the little spider, there wasn't much room to work with, and so it was the 2 shade rule for me. First I went in with the C7, coloured the whole area, did a little shading with the 100, went back in with the C7 to blend together. And moving on to the little bats, again, really small space to work with. So I simply went in with a lighter shade, in this instance C7, and applied that all over the bats, and then went in completely at random here, added some of the darker shades of C8 and 100. There really was no fashion to it. I just went in, dotted it around, and hoped for the best. With darker elements such as the spider and the bats you can see a little bit of shading on there, but the spider looks a little bit blocky. And so I do come back to this later just to bring it back to life a little bit. I'll show you that soon. Also, you can see from the bottom of the envelope and the left hand side, the colour has bled outside of the lines a little bit. The colours that I used, the Copic markers that I used, were quite juicy, particularly the darker shade, the V09. So by the time I went back and forth, it was only inevitable that it would bleed a little bit. There is a technique that I use with darker colours only. You can tend to get away with it, but again, that's something I'll show you very soon. And so for the final bit of colouring, I did the little ghost in C1 and C3. I do apologise, I needed to pause the recording of my voiceover at that point. It's getting very noisy around me all of a sudden. My back garden has become somewhat like Trafalgar Square with the amount of birds out there. Noisy neighbours, noisy dogs, building works, aeroplanes. I shan't go on, but you get the idea. So back to the task at hand. The little ghost was done in C1 and C3. C3 for the shading, C1 for the body of colour. I didn't feel that I needed to go back in and blend these because the C3 then wouldn't particularly show very well anyway. I missed a small area under one of the bats, so I went back in with the 15, I believe. Okay, so here is where I rectified the bleed of the colouring. I took my black fine liner in 0.3 and I drew a faux edge around the existing envelope outline. I took it out as far as I needed to cover the bleed, and then where there was white gaps between the faux outline and the original outline, I went in with the fine liner and filled these gaps in. Here I didn't quite cover the bleed, so I extended that outline further, and you can see by this point it has been quite effective in hiding the bleed. So as I said before, this trickery only really tends to work on darker colours. For lighter colours, I have previously gone in with a white gel pen, and that is just as effective. Whilst I still had the black fine liner, I went around the finer lines in the image, such as the spider web, and just simply went over them with the fine liner. They tend to get a little bit lost in colouring, and so this brings them back to life again. I also did the small spider's legs there as well. And we mustn't forget Frankenstein's little bolts too. Okay, so previously in the tutorial I did say that I would bring the spider back to life because he's a little dark, and all I did was go in and gave him some eyes. I did the same for the little bats as well there, as you can see, and I think this is really effective. Unfortunately, I come to realise at this point that the video had blurred and remains that way for the remaining 30 seconds or so of the video, so I do apologise. However, my last step for this colouring project was to go in and add some white highlights using my white gel pen. It's a classic crafter's technique. There's no rule to where you place the white highlight. It just adds added interest. Thankfully here you can see it close up, not blurred. And here is the coloured image in its final project. I hope you enjoyed this colouring tutorial. I don't pretend to be a professional, but I do hope that my techniques can help someone along the way. I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye bye.